So this is the story where Gambit becomes the Horseman Death. It's a story called Blood of Apocalypse, and it takes place in X-Men issues 182 to 186, in case you want to go and read it. This takes place after House of M, so there's only about 198 mutants left, give or take, the number has changed, and Apocalypse shows up at the Xavier Institute where they're all located. As soon as he arrives here, it's this grandiose speech where he effectively tells them, I am your salvation, right? Hand yourself to me and you will survive to see the dawn, because anyone who is not on my side is against me. Now, Gambit is here when it all goes down. And I wouldn't say the X-Men panic, not in that way. It's really more of just like, this is the last thing we need right now. House of M just happened. The last thing we need is a immortal, narcissistic demigod showing up on our doorstep telling us he's the path to salvation. So initially they try to figure out what to do, but in the midst of it all, Gambit sneaks off. Now, we will circle back around to what happens between the time that Gambit sneaks off and when Gambit meets with Apocalypse, but let's jump to that moment, right? When Gambit goes to meet with Apocalypse and becomes the Horseman Death. When he shows up here, Apocalypse says, I've been expecting you. And that's where Gambit's question is, like, up until about 2 seconds ago, I wasn't even sure that I could do this. And the reality is that Gambit feels kind of ignored and disrespected by the X-Men. In some ways, rightfully so, it's something that he's earned, and in some ways not. But the reality is that Apocalypse preys on people that he's looking to turn into horsemen. He preys on their insecurities, and that's how he usually rallies them to their side. Either that or he just forces them to become horsemen. Whatever the reason is, he tells Gambit, he says, you told yourself that everyone can get along. Mutant and man, we can all live in peace. And Gambit says, I believed it. And so that's where Apocalypse says, but now you start to realize that these dark days require darker ways. And so Gambit responds and says, I don't seem to be listened to anymore. And Apocalypse says they're scared to listen. And Gambit says, somehow I've been relegated. And Apocalypse says, because you are better than them. And so he says, here, let us drink, mighty Gambit, to a new partnership, to a new world. Now, at that point, we jump to the process by which Gambit becomes the Horseman. And I will say, man, it's pretty intense. Just FYI. And one of the things to know, this is a backup feature in the comic. It's actually called Riddles of the Sphinx. It's basically its own 5-part miniseries within an existing storyline. It's pretty dope, written by Peter Milligan, right? And so that's where Gambit tells Apocalypse, I don't want painkillers. He says, I want to feel every ounce of pain that I am going to experience here. And so Apocalypse kind of looks at him funny, like, damn, my guy, right? And he says, I would recommend something to deaden the pain, at least in phase 1 of the transformation, when the instruments burrow deep into your mind. But that's when he says, I must be conscious the whole time. I want to be fully aware of just what you're doing to me, Apocalypse. And so Apocalypse is like, I mean, if you want it, man, he says, as you wish, right? We will not be requiring the juice of Thoth, Ozymandias. And that's where Gambit's just like, just one question. What exactly does this thing do? And Apocalypse kind of looks at it for a second and is like, the Claw of Horus. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest with you, right? The transformation machine seems to have a life of its own, something to do with the lower intestines, maybe. But it's kind of a little bit of this idea that Apocalypse doesn't fully understand the ship he's using, which is true. There's precedence for this, right? If you actually read Cable and Deadpool, we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But in the midst of all of this, Ozymandias kind of makes this observation where he says, Gambit is here because he hates the X-Men. And Apocalypse just says, it's nothing to be ashamed of, Gambit. A man like you, an X-Man like you, should have been treated with more respect. And so Gambit at that point is like, what in the hell's going into my back, right? And Apocalypse just says, the transformation begins, brave Gambit. Tiny metal fingers work through your flesh, headed for the intricate hieroglyphs in your spinal cord. And he says, my scribe is right. You should not fear the truth. You have joined us because the X-Men treated you like rubbish. And Apocalypse says, you told me yourself how they pushed you aside, demoted you, stopped listening to you. You, the mighty Gambit, by any logic, considering your unique heritage, you should have been leader of the X-Men. And he says, and may I say, Gambit, that you can tell a lot about a man by the smell of his singeing mutton. And that's where Gambit's just like, you're wrong. right? He says, I am not doing this because I hate the X-Men. I'm doing this because I love the X-Men. And he says, I almost believe you when you say that you are on the mutants' side this time. I can tell you've changed. House of M has brought out the best in you. We need your strength here. But if you're lying, scheming, if behind the mask, the old self-serving Apocalypse wants to pounce, then I will be right by your side, watching and waiting. And that's where Apocalypse is like, of course, right? Of course you will. And it's kind of an interesting moment here because Ozymandias kind of asked the question, do you think he'd be able to mentally withstand this whole thing, right? Do you not concern yourself with the idea that a fully empowered X-Man is going to be standing sentry over you? And that's where Apocalypse just says, I'm not worried about that because the man who comes out of that chamber will not be the same man who went into it in the first place. And that's the crazy thing, because winding back, when he showed up here, presented himself to everybody as a kind of savior. Apocalypse's main goal here is directly associated with the cure that he's been creating based off his own blood. Now, the idea behind what Apocalypse wants to do is actually brought to bear when he's talking about the blood directly. And it's actually in a conversation that he has with Ozymandias. Because before Gambit showed up on the scene here, Ozymandias asked the question, the Horseman war, Master was pleased with him. And Apocalypse says, I do not seek pleasure, I seek satisfaction, and I will not be satisfied until our complete victory. And that's where Ozymandias tells him, then strike now. Right? Why draw this out, right? Why have this whole plan in the first place? Why not just wipe out the entirety of the human population? You could easily do it, and there really aren't any X-Men left, so who's really going to be able to stop you? And that's where Apocalypse says, not until we produce more blood. How else are we to save 10% of humanity when pestilence falls upon them? Because the Horseman pestilence is not here right now. The Horseman pestilence is on a mission for Apocalypse, gathering every illness and disease you could possibly think of. The bubonic plague, the lettuce that's giving everybody explosive diarrhea, the whole 9 yards. Right, just every possible illness. And the reason for this is explained by Apocalypse when he's talking to Ozymandias. And Ozymandias, again, is like, why have the antidote? Why not just wipe out all the humans and then mutants can inherit the earth? And Apocalypse says, you don't understand, Ozymandias. I want mutants to triumph, but only if they are worthy. I will level the playing fields a little. Let humankind and mutant kind both be reduced to 10% of their former numbers, and then let the final battle commence. That's the goal, right? The goal here was to show up, use famine to push the mutant population towards a state of hunger, so they would basically consume the blood of Apocalypse, which is the cure to everything that famine is going to unleash. And then in turn, allow famine to unleash all of that on the world. But there is a bit of a caveat here, but we'll talk about that here in a second. For right now, it's actually a mission between Pulse and Rogue and Havoc to show up and to confront Apocalypse, but they're also being aided by Ozymandias. The reason being because Ozymandias at this point, having been constantly disrespected by Apocalypse, has come to believe that Apocalypse has lost his mind. Right, that he's not really a sane person. And so what Ozymandias did is initially he approached the Horseman War and tried to convince the Horseman War to kill Apocalypse, but the Horseman War wouldn't do it. And in fact, Gazer, who is what War used to be before he was turned into a Horseman, goes and tells Apocalypse everything that Ozymandias has just told him, right? They're like, Ozymandias is trying to kill you, just so you know. Following that and the failed attempt to get War to his side, Ozymandias ended up infiltrating the Xavier Institute. He was caught by Colossus, and Colossus almost killed him, to be honest, right? I mean, he's literally like grabbing him by the throat. But that's where Ozymandias tells them, right? Apocalypse is crazy. He's lost his mind. Something's not right here. A sickness, illness, whatever, but he needs to be destroyed because he will lead to the ruin of all. And that's where he says, there's a secret passage into the Sphinx. I can take you, lead you all the way directly to him, which is how you get this team in the first place. Now, Pulse is essentially the key to all of this. And the reason why is because Augustus has the ability to negate powers. Technically, he emits a disruptive field, but for these particular purposes, being able to disrupt the powers of others, that's what they need, because effectively, he could shut down the powers of Apocalypse. Now, they don't definitively know that that's the case. They assume it is, because Rogue's powers didn't work work when she was in the vicinity of Pulse. Literally, they were able to touch each other. And so because of that, there's all the reason to believe he's the way in which to destroy Apocalypse. And that's what happens. Ozymandias shows up here leading the team led by Havoc. Between Havoc and Rogue and Pulse shutting Apocalypse's powers down, yeah, this will do the job. It'll be enough to get the job done. The problem is that Apocalypse also has people that have come to his side, not just his Horsemen. That's an important distinction to understand. Not everyone on the side of Apocalypse now is one of his Horsemen. Some of them are mutants who believe in the philosophy of Apocalypse and see him effectively as their savior. So I wouldn't call it religious conviction. Depending on who you're talking about here, it's just kind of making the smart move. And that's why this statement's made. Apocalypse explained it all to us. He's on our side. It's what we've been waiting for. He's our savior. That kind of thing, right? That's the kind of conviction that these guys have. And so Rogue, in seeing all of this, says, don't be so stupid. He does not give a hoot about any of us. And that's where Apocalypse says, that is untrue. If anything, I care too much about you. It was your suffering that woke me from a peaceful sleep. And so that's where Ozymandias is like, everybody needs to stop talking. Attack him now. He is hiding something. I don't know what he's hiding, but I've been a part of this man's life for years, and I know when he's up to something. And that's where Apocalypse just says, my scribe knows me well, but it's not something I am hiding. It is someone, my fourth Horseman, freshly imagined, newly minted. And that's when he's presented to everyone here. And Gambit as the Horseman Death looks incredible. I mean, he always looked amazing when he was the Horseman Death. And so, of course, the first one to approach him is Rogue, right? Like, what have they done to you? And Apocalypse just says he saw that mutantkind needed a leader and he wished to serve that leader. And so Rogue is, of course, like, I wasn't talking to you. But Gambit smacks her out of the way and goes to stomp on her head. In that moment, she looks at him and she says, Remy. And he kind of pauses for a second and then doesn't do it. So that moment of hesitation is enough for Rogue to pick up on the idea Gambit's still in there, right? He's still in there somewhere. How much of a Horseman he is, I don't know, but he is still in there somewhere. And so in that moment, they use it as an opportunity to attack, but ultimately it doesn't really work. And the reason why is because of the fact that in the midst of this fight, right, between this little bit of a field team and Apocalypse, that Havoc fires off a blast and Apocalypse fires off one of his own. Havoc's blast ends up flying into the tank that holds the blood of Apocalypse, which basically destroys the antidote. So that kills off the initial plan of Apocalypse to use the antidote to spare 10% of humanity, which kicks in as plan B. That's the caveat that I was telling you about. The second thing that happens is the ship is damaged in the process. Now, because this is a celestial ship, it can repair itself, but Apocalypse also has to kick in his second plan as well. The problem with this is that with Gambit now here as the Horseman Death, Apocalypse is pissed off as he ever was. The ship itself starts to depart because it basically operates on its own, right? And so at that point, the only thing they can do is retreat, right? The X-Men team's got to get out of there as fast as they can because they don't know where it's going to take them, right? That's what Ozymandias says here, that when Havoc fires off a shot at Apocalypse and hits him, certainly not enough to destroy him, Ozymandias says, you have bought several seconds, no more. Once the ship has been stirred, nothing can calm it. And so where Rogue is trying to find a way to bring Gambit back, Gambit just says, I am not Remy, I am Death. But again, it feels like this kind of internal fight, right? Gambit versus the Horseman persona that's been instilled in him by Apocalypse. And so of course that leads to the Horseman War, who's basically been here the whole time fighting against Colossus and Cyclops and those guys. Hence the reason why they didn't show up here in this bit of a skirmish. He basically makes it out just long enough to be able to take off. Not only that, one of the cool things that we learned here is that the Horseman famine is actually Sunfire. Sunfire had been taken by Apocalypse and transformed into a Horseman. Now, of course, ultimately, this mental conditioning is essentially undone by a combination of the X-Men's efforts, no thanks to Emma Frost. I mean, she's literally the biggest reason why that happens. But at this point, the only two Horsemen really remaining for Apocalypse are Gambit and Gazer, right? War. And that's when you switch over to the United Nations. Apocalypse's ship shows up here. And when that happens, he just busts into this place and says, you world leaders will listen to what Apocalypse says. And of course, there's some cops that show up here and Apocalypse just incinerates them on the spot and says, Now then, the mutant population has dropped to less than 10% of its former numbers, but I will redress the balance of power. To this end, my Horseman pestilence has been creating a meta plague that can wipe out every human being on the planet. Alongside my plague, I had been developing the antidote made from my very own blood, enough to save 10% of the human population. I had planned to distribute this, but thanks to the X-Men, these plans have been screwed up. Is that not so, Death? And Gambit just says, the X-Men did not understand how times have changed. And so Apocalypse says precisely, stocks of antidote are too low to save more than a few of you, so I have come to offer a deal. I will keep my pestilence at bay. I will even destroy the meta plague that my Horseman carries if you yourselves cull 90% of your human stock. And everybody here is just like, cull? You want us to wipe out 90% of our own race? And Apocalypse says, cull, exterminate, kill. You have enough bombs and poison gases to do this many times over. Sacrifice 90% of your number and 10% of you shall survive. Humans and mutants will share the world, fight for its resources, and may the best species win. You have 1 week to comply. After that, pestilence will be let loose and the entire human population will perish, which is just a crazy statement to make here. It's kind of bonkers. And so at that point, pestilence arrives back here after this long mission, gathering all these different illnesses. And Apocalypse says, Pestilence, the time approaches. Your brother, Horseman Death, seems to be experiencing inner conflict, trying to reconcile his old and his new self. Before I release you, I must be sure. And he asks that you know who you are and who you no longer are. So, how do you feel when I say the name Polaris? And she just says, I feel nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so now, with Pestilence back onto the scene, we got 3 Horsemen. We're missing Famine, but we have War, Death, and Pestilence. And so with Apocalypse's actions showing up here to the UN, the Avengers show up here. You don't really get to see very many instances where other teams outside of the X-Men universe face off against Apocalypse. It's not to say it does not happen, it's just to say you don't get to see it much. And that's kind of the cool thing here, right? The new Avengers uniting to face off against him. Also keep in mind, because we're all talking about the Civil War era and everything here, that's why you have Spider-Man who's wearing his Civil War suit, which always looks dope. I always love the Iron Spider. But the point is, with them on the scene here, the Avengers can only do so much. And that's why Captain America says, I spoke to Richards. If we want to wait a few days, the Fantastic Four can help out. And that's where it's like, we don't need any help. And it's like, but I kind of think you do, because you guys are kind of getting demolished. And you're not even fighting Apocalypse. You're just kind of getting demolished by like laser beams and photon torpedoes, right? And so Captain America's just like, that's what I told him, right? More or less. And so Wolverine just basically says, pity you don't tell Apocalypse that too. And that's kind of the cool thing, right? Iron Man says, whatever it's hitting us with is messing up my armor's energy shield. It went straight to the marrow. But then they look up and they realize the cavalry's on the way, because now we're talking about Valerie Cooper's O1E Sentinels who are arriving here on the scene, with the X-Men regrouping and intending to launch an attack of their own to confront Apocalypse as best they can. And notice this, right? While these guys are able to hold their own to some degree against Apocalypse's ship, at the end of the day, Apocalypse doesn't really seem too overly concerned about it, right? In fact, Polaris says, Master, we cannot stop them. They're going to keep coming right at us. And Apocalypse just says, I know, Pestilence. Aren't they magnificent? Right? He doesn't take them seriously in any real way. And that's where Gambit's just like, magnificent. The guy's lost his mind, right? And of course, War's like, those are treacherous words, man. But Gambit says, but it's the truth. Apocalypse taught me that death speaks the truth, and I am, without doubt, death. And that's where the whole Sphinx is destroyed. Well, not really destroyed, but it's basically shot down and crashes in the water. And so when the X-Men arrive back on the scene again, right, the question is asked, like, what about them? What about the X-Men? And Apocalypse just says, I have built this Sphinx with unearthly materials using plans drawn up by the gods. We are not defenseless. And so again, he's not overly concerned, but that was always Apocalypse's weakness. His arrogance, his hubris was always the thing that got the better of him. At least with Thanos, he could back that shit up. With Apocalypse, he gets clapped like plenty of times. He's powerful, man, but he's not like this just immutable force that cannot be destroyed because he was banned from the realm of Mistress Death, traveling the stars for like eons. Right? No. That's the reason why Thanos would stomp a mud hole in this guy. But the fact is, in this moment, Polaris tries to tell Apocalypse, you cannot let the X-Men take you. You must escape and continue your work elsewhere. And Apocalypse just says, no, Pestilence. History tells us that the weak run while the strong write history. So he's ready to jump into this fight. And that's exactly what he does. He's like, enough. Guy just backhands Bobby Drake, just sends this guy flying. And even Havoc is just like, this guy's strength is incredible, right? Like Gambit comes up behind Havoc, clocks him in the back of the head, and then Rogue shows up and attacks Gambit. And it's like, Remy, darling, don't you know who I am, right? I am doing this to save you, right? She's fighting like a woman scorned. But then you get this amazing moment where Cyclops steps up, and Cyclops fires off this optic beam at Apocalypse. Now, here's the thing about Cyclops. Cyclops' optic beams are oftentimes so misleading if you're not familiar with them. I would say that for the casual person out there who is familiar with Cyclops, they would probably think the larger the beam, the more destructive it is. Not necessarily, right? When this guy condenses his beam down into like a tiny little just straight firing line, I would argue that's deadlier than any gigantic beam he could fire off. It's like a tornado sending a piece of straw through a telephone pole, right? It's insane how precise he can be with this. Now, it's not enough to destroy Apocalypse, not even close. And Apocalypse says that, right? I have lost much of my precious blood, Pestilence. There is no use waiting any longer. Go spread your plagues throughout humanity. Kill them all. And she just says, yes, master. And at that point, takes off. And so War shows up to the side of Apocalypse, and the two of them are ready to go down and throw down against the X-Men. And I'll tell you right now, man, if it comes down to it, Apocalypse and War facing off against the X-Men, I would like to believe they would dominate these guys. Like none of the X-Men, just these two. I mean, look at him. Like, look at War. The guy's the most menacing thing I've ever seen. The problem is that Ozymandias comes up behind him and stabs him through the back with a blade. And he says, I saved Gazer's life before he became War. He was meant to repay me, but then reneged on that payment. Now, the reckoning has been settled, because that was the idea of Ozymandias. He would go to War, he would tell War what Apocalypse was doing, that Apocalypse was crazy, they would have to destroy him. And because War owed Ozymandias, he was supposed to pay that blood debt, and he didn't. And that's where Ozymandias gets it in, which is actually with a spear, not a sword. But the fact is, when Ozymandias says, the reckoning has been settled, Apocalypse says, not with me, Ozymandias. The crazy thing about this, right, is that when the statement's made, right, he's all out of Horsemen, right? This is our one and only chance. Apocalypse just says, my precious blood may be wasted, but killing you X-Men will be some compensation. The problem is that in the middle of this blast, his power's shut down. And the question is like, what in the hell is happening to him? And that's when you find out Pulse is behind him, nullifying his abilities, literally shutting down the powers of Apocalypse. Sunfire shows up and fires off this blast that, again, isn't enough to kill him, but it severely weakens him. And so at this point, it's a losing game. Apocalypse cannot win this fight. So this guy bails out. He actually ends up passing through one of the doors inside the Sphinx that they can't easily gain access to. And then this guy, dude, if ever there was a question of whether Apocalypse was unhinged in this story or not, this is the answer to it, right? He's just like 5,000-year-old instructions telling me how to operate the infernal machine. I will blow up this entire vessel, destroying all in it. Yes, I'll kill everyone. The dude's so unhinged. She's like, if I'm going down, everybody's going down with me. I ain't dying alone, right? It's kind of nuts. But that's when the X-Men catch up to him, right? Havoc shows up here, and he even asks the question, right? Is this like suicide Apocalypse, right? The coward's way out. And Apocalypse just says, it takes courage to do what I am doing. The infernal machine has torn a mouth in the membrane of space. This is my escape. That's it. And ultimately ends up disappearing, right? He teleports away. And so initially, you don't find out what happens to him. And so following this, right, because of the fact that Sunfire had grabbed Gambit and just taken off. Literally, Rogue's just like, where are you going with Remy? And Sunfire doesn't say anything, right? He just leaves. The other Horseman who's here is Polaris, and she's basically undergoing mental conditioning treatment in order to cure her of the whole affliction when she was infected by Apocalypse. It's one of the interesting things about her. Polaris was one of the mutants that lost her powers during House of M. And in fact, that's how Apocalypse got his hands on her. In the aftermath of House of M and in X-Men issues 180 to 181, she was out fighting the Sapien League alongside Dupe, and Apocalypse literally took her, right? Like attacked her, took her, and turned her into Pestilence. Although he did kind of prey on the idea that she had lost her powers and that he could kind of give her life new meaning. But again, we don't entirely know where Apocalypse is. But then we find out, right, that when he passed from the Sphinx and made his escape, that's when you pick up with this bit of Apocalypse's history here, that Apocalypse kind of shows up in this place, the Sphinx, right, out there in the desert. And he ends up being met with this voice. And this is where you get that bit of history with Apocalypse and the Celestials, which is to say Apocalypse recollects on this. The memory is so powerful, it pains. It is as though I am there. So many years ago in Egypt, I had labored hard to build the Sphinx, following hieroglyphic instructions I had found. Now, this strange bodiless voice unnerved me. And he says, it was true. Much of the time, the strange ship seemed to be building itself, because that's what the voice asks him, right? Like, are you sure you're the one building this ship? And that's when you get this moment where Apocalypse essentially activates it. And when that happens, he's met by the Celestials. Specifically, he's met by Isan the Searcher. And this is why I say a lot of what you guys see in X-Men 97 is very familiar to what you see here, because Isan says, you have inherited these scientific riches, which will help you become a feared, powerful creature who might yet shape his world's destiny. And Apocalypse asks, yes, this is how I suspected my life would be. Because of course, you know, why would you assume anything else? But Isan says, these riches are not free. There is a contract to be agreed upon. And Isan says, know this, Apocalypse, I am a Celestial. I speak through an art known as telepathy. My words are hewn from the dust of stars and travel great distances to find you. If you accept these riches, there will come a time when we will demand something of you in return, perhaps in centuries or millennia. We do not yet know, because given the age of Celestials, millennia is a day for humanity, the blink of an eye, right? It's basically no meaningful passage of time at all. But Isan says, but the day will come when we will seek repayment from you, Apocalypse, perhaps with your life or even more. Say no, and our technology will be removed. You will never hear from us again. You must answer forthwith. Great power now, but perhaps greater suffering later. And Apocalypse says, not one day has passed since when I have not wondered, is this the day they come? The day I finally know what it is they want from me. That's why Apocalypse launched this crusade in the first place. I have no fear of death, is what he says. And by dying now, I cheat that strange, distant God who threw his voice into my head. The contract remains unpaid. So take me, death, rather you than the Celestials. And that's where Isan says no, and immediately grabs him and whisks him away. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.